Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. So I'm joined by folks from a few different cities around the so-called U.S. who have been working around anti-repression work, at least since, if not before and during and throughout the George Floyd Uprisings of this summer, and I was hoping that folks could sort of share their experiences of lessons they've learned, takeaways, some of the folks that they're supporting, and so on. I think this, if resistance is going to continue being a thing, this is going to be an ongoing conversation that's going to happen. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I really appreciate y'all taking the time to do this. Would someone go ahead and introduce themselves, maybe name, moniker, pronouns, what anti-repression group that you affiliate with, and sort of a little bit about the group moving into the uprising, like what it looked like?
Hi, my name is Dell, but I go by Earthworm. I am with the Atlanta Solidarity Fund and the Atlanta Jail Support Team.
Hi, my name is Liam. I go by Lil Guillotine, and I organize with Free the 350 Bail Fund here in Madison, Wisconsin, as well as a few other organizing groups, General Defense Committee, IWW, and other grassroots groups in town.
Hi, this is Charlie. I am in the Puget Sound Prisoner Support Collective here in so-called Seattle. We've been around for a number of years. I think it was May Day 2015 that we started, because that day there was, I think, 15 or 16 arrests at the May Day demo here in Seattle. That always seems to happen. And we were astounded by the number of arrests. So we formed this kind of ad hoc group, which since May 28th has been a little bit less ad hoc and a little bit more formal.
Hi, my name is Mala, and I am here representing the Salt Lake General Defense Committee, which was formed after we had a series of arrests here that have escalated into felony charges and some very hefty charges. I represent a whole other variety of coalitions, but for this call, I'm just going to go by Salt Lake General Defense Committee.
Hey, this is Susan Samples. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm with the Michigan Solidarity Bail Fund. Also work with the Michigan Anti-Repression Group. We started back a couple of years ago when Richard Spencer was in town and raised a bunch of money for arrests back then. Got a lot of that money back and just kind of put that into a pot to start our bail fund. So we were sitting on that for a bit, and we're ready to go for quite a while. And then May 30th, things popped off in Grand Rapids specifically, but in other towns throughout Michigan. And we've spent close to $300,000, I guess, in Grand Rapids alone, for about 17 defendants. So we're dealing with some pretty high-end charges and intense situations.
Would folks care to share sort of what the uprising looked like where they were? Like what sort of resistance, how sustained it was? Also in the instances like where you were, did you find that there were existent or pre-existing cases of police brutality or murder by police that helped to like galvanize folks in the streets? Like I know here in Asheville 4 years ago, a lot of people were pulling from the Jai Williams being killed by police and the State Bureau of Investigation report never being released about that. So like his family got involved in a lot of the calls for an end to police violence or abolition of the police or what have you. It sort of melded those two calls.
This is Liam Lil Guillotine from Madison. There was a really interesting situation here in Madison as far as sustained protests happening from more police brutality and murders of Black folks here in the county, Thane County, because, you know, we're close to Kenosha, Wisconsin. And when that happened, the uprising there, like a few weeks ago, there was a big, simultaneous uprising or uptick of rebellion here in Madison. But then interestingly, we had 2 Black youth who were murdered by police here in Dane County in Monona, which is an adjacent city to Madison. And one of them, and basically I think, and it was really interesting because there was not that much of an uptick in rebellion. And I think it had a lot to do with the police propaganda around how they handled it. They talked about how the one youth like crashed his car and then ran into like a lagoon or a swamp and then wasn't found for 3 days, even though the cops were like chasing him with a police dog. And then they just didn't find him. And then he turned up dead 3 days after that. And, it's kind of frustrating too, because you got calls to action after this murder and like folks just didn't show up for whatever reason. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that, the police are like denying all kind of that they did anything, even though, in my opinion and many others people's opinion, it's fairly obvious that they had a big part to do in that murder. And there was another one about a month ago where there was a young black man who was in a police chase, and then he stopped, and this was also the Monona police. And interestingly, the exact same cops who were involved in the previous murder of the black youth a few weeks earlier. And he stopped his car like on a busy street, got out, and then shot himself in front of the police. And like, even though there was no firearm that was found, and that was even more blatantly like a suspicious police activity where this black youth was killed, in our opinion, by this cop. And for some reason, like the movement just didn't get an uptick from that. And again, I think it had to do with the fact that the police were so sly and the media in cooperation of repeating the rhetoric of the cops and painting it as, not their fault. So, it's an interesting thing. Like Rosa Luxemburg talks about like spontaneity and revolution. But yeah, we thought it was going to happen then, but it did not. But like I said, the Kenosha uprising had a big impact here in Madison. And again, it's like after folks are rising up, that's when people here started rising up. It wasn't right after the murder. It was like they were taking the lead of the community in Kenosha. And then once the community members started rising up, folks here in Madison did. And it was the same for George Floyd. We didn't have a serious rebellion until the Saturday after. So that was like 5 days, I think, because it happened on Monday, I believe. And and then, folks here took suit and followed and had some major uprisings. And it's a really interesting situation downtown because all of the glass is like covered up, boarded up, and it's like a whole new place down there, and a place that's really gentrified and it's kind of really like an anti-black zone. And now it's kind of like a more communal space, and the rebellion's not really sustained. It's been like kind of quiet here for about 2 months now, so hoping to continue the struggle. But yeah, that was the interesting situation here in Madison.
I can speak a little to the situation here in the Seattle area. I think that the general arc of what has happened in Seattle since May 28th, May 29th has been pretty well documented. But some major aspects, the rebellion looked kind of similar in the beginning to a lot of other like semi-large cities. That first Saturday saw a huge, really Friday night and into Saturday, saw a huge response to the murder of George Floyd that culminated in huge riots and rebellious activity in the downtown area. And then as that specifically slowed down, more protest-oriented dynamics started to show up, less kind of spontaneous, like creative destruction and looting and rioting, and more organized demonstrations. A thing that we did have happen here was the suburbs outside the city, Bellevue, Tukwila, areas just outside the Seattle metro, saw really large-scale, coordinated, like heavily politicized looting activity on gentrifying areas and major economic corridors and corridors of commerce in the surrounding areas, starting on that Sunday. And so from the first night, like on the Saturday the 29th, there was anywhere between 80 and 100 arrests, almost all for the charge is burglary, but generally understood as looting. And that's kind of where our crew stepped back into action. Our group generally only operates a couple times a year when there's big demonstrations, and we know that there's going to be arrests. We're not usually needed beyond that, but we really stepped in to start working with the existing groups here, specifically the Seattle chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. And since then, we've coupled with a really incredible local law firm called Smith Law and other organizations. Yeah, things really sustained here for a really long time and have taken on generally different tones as I can't believe I'm saying this, but as the months progressed. We had the Chaz and then the Chop, same space, different idea, which maintained for a long time and was really only put down through kind of like counterinsurgency tactics by the city and pretty massive scale repression from the Seattle Police Department. Since then, in the same area, autonomous mutual aid efforts have popped up in conjunction with the ongoing rebellion. There's an encampment in Cal Anderson Park that is like a hub of political activity, as well as being a space for the houseless community to live and gather. That space has been routinely attacked by the Seattle Police Department, and the park has been like what we call swept. The park has been cleared in 5 a.m. raids over and over and over again, especially earlier in the summer when mutual aid groups had moved into an unused shelter house inside the park and opened it up for mutual aid efforts like clothing exchanges, food, things of that nature. The city came in and shut those down. We still have, on any given day, between 1 and 3 different demonstrations. And there are several different styles of organizing and styles of demonstrations that have shown up. But as things happen, as the police murder more Black and Indigenous people in the Northwest and the country, the demonstrations and the efforts to confront that continually pop back up. The Seattle Police Department has a long history of violence, like most police departments, but at a certain point, the federal government actually stepped in to basically consider it a sanction against the Seattle Police Department for their excessive use of force. And that was back in 2012. So the SPD is currently under the federal consent decree where they've got to prove that they aren't a brutal police force anymore. And they've yet to be able to do that. They're still under Department of Justice scrutiny. And a lot of that came from the response to a specific murder of a man named John T. Williams. A Native man was murdered by SPD nearly a decade ago. And that spurred probably the last large-scale sustained demonstrations in response to a specific police murder. Since then, the Seattle Police Department and surrounding police departments have murdered an untold number of people from various BIPOC communities. There's actually large-scale events happening tonight south of us in Vancouver, Washington, as the police murdered yet again another person. Another young Black man was shot to death by the police. And so there's demonstrations happening here in Seattle and in Vancouver tonight. But I would say that the consistent response to the murders of Charlene Lyles and others in the Seattle area has sustained what has become a very confrontational movement against, maybe probably started off as against egregious police murders and has now really metamorphosized into a very, very adamant and strong direct action oriented abolitionist movement here in Seattle.
Well, Salt Lake City is a little city, We're not really a big city with a lot of big things. And I think because of that, for years, we didn't really have a lot of really good, strong infrastructure when it came down to anti-fascist infrastructure. We had the ganas, we had the energy, but I think there just wasn't enough of us. So for us, I guess how it really started was 2 days before George Floyd was murdered. Here locally, actually just a few blocks away from where I live, Bernardo Palacios Carvajal was murdered by police officers. And he was only 22 years old, So for us, we were already mourning Bernardo when George Floyd was murdered. And so I think that when people hit the streets that day, I think it felt almost like all of our rage, all of our pent-up rage was, there, manifested in front of us. And those days, the streets were beautiful. And I mean, I've never seen the streets of Salt Lake City as rowdy as they were that day. I remember one of the most beautiful sights was they had this police car overturned, this pig car, and it was on fire, and someone had spray painted Losky because that was Bernardo's tag on the bumper, And for a lot of us, like it was like reclaiming something, like taking something back. Like this is now an altar for us, And I think for a lot of us in the like Latinx, indigenous community, we saw Bernardo's face and we saw a lot of us ourselves, He was a young person, he was a tagger, he was from the graffiti community. And Salt Lake, we're a train city, so we've always got a lot of train hoppers and graph kids. So I think what we've seen so far has been a lot of it's almost like a series of actions centered in art, like really, really art-centered, graph-centered, community-centered actions. Most of the biggest actions we've had were buckets, gallons of red paint allegedly thrown on the the district attorney's office, literally just on the pavement, done that multiple times, multiple groups of propagandists springing up, posters being pumped out, honestly, like by the hundreds. And for us, as we're anti-fascist, but we're also printmakers and artists. For us, it was really beautiful just seeing like the energy of the city come out mass force. I think what fueled it definitely was like our rage over the murder of Black and Brown Indigenous bodies, but also just the relationship, right? We saw a rage in all the other cities' rage, so then we wanted to be angrier too, and it was like we weren't afraid anymore, So everybody was coming out and shit. Like I said, I've never seen Salt Lake City the way that I've seen Salt Lake City the past few months. New groups started springing up, but it was always like in a good way, like people, I remember at one point, Bernardo's family was planning something because Bernardo's mom was like, I'm going to stay on the streets until, like, I'm going to be on the streets because my kid was murdered, So she was on the streets, so we were on the streets. And then we found out that there was a rally led by undocumented people down the street. And some of us were also undocumented, So then instead of being, weird about it, we were just like, let's combine the rallies or let's push ours back by a few hours so that way the rallies can have harmony. There you go. And I think, at least in my opinion, that's something that I've seen a lot. It's because since we're a small city, everybody knows everybody. We're just trying to be fair to each other, be nice to each other, and be in solidarity with each other. Now, currently what we're seeing as far as charges go is we have some ridiculous charges, people facing like life in prison for allegedly buying, the red paint that allegedly got thrown in the governor or district attorney's office, people facing federal charges and shit like that. So we're working on that as crews, we're all kind of like showing up in solidarity with each other. And it's a lot had to do with like, even as COVID-19 started, some of the same people that are doing the mutual aid runs are some of the same people facing charges. And then they're the same people that are like part of the crew of the homie that got murdered. And so it's been a lot of intersections and overlaps in the work more than anything. That's all I got to say about that, I guess.
Well, I'll talk about Atlanta. This is Earthworm. So after George Floyd was killed, the protests ramped up pretty fast at the end of May. So by May 29th, people were out in the streets. There were fiery demonstrations downtown, seeing, 50 or 100 arrests a night up until about June 2nd. There was National Guard called out. That didn't work. People were still in the street. The city declared a citywide curfew. So if you were out past 9 o'clock, you would get arrested. And they were arresting people at like 9:06, man. That you were out there. They were rounding up just about anybody. So finally, that curfew ended up being able to quash the protests. But before that, they really couldn't get it under control because, they would clear out one area of a park or one street corner or one block, and people would just go coalesce on another one. So once that curfew happened and you were able to get arrested just for existing outside at night, I think that's what ended up kind of quieting things down. And we saw just a trickle of arrests and different actions. I mean, there's been a demonstration at night almost every night ever since May. I guess it's been tapering off some, but in terms of the anger and the fieriness and the size of them, they definitely tapered off with that curfew. So they lifted the curfew and things were, the protests were much more, mellow and tame. And then Rayshard Brooks was killed on June 12th. So that led to a resurgence. People were out on the streets June 13th. The Wendy's that he was killed at was torched, and that parking lot with the Wendy's in it, that lot was claimed by protesters who set up an occupation there and were sleeping there around the clock. And they want to turn it into a peace center, a community center. So, June 13th through maybe 15th, we were seeing a lot of protests as well. And then things have just kind of been sporadically popping off since then. There was a Georgia State Patrol building that was, small fires were lit in it. It was vandalized on the early morning of July 5th. There was an ICE building that was vandalized with fireworks and small fires July 26th. And the thing that we're seeing a lot of now is protests, even just really mellow protests with 20 to 50 people marching in the street. Police are arresting handfuls of people or dozens of people and charging them with jaywalking, which is really surprising for Atlanta because the city's always taken a pretty hands-off approach to mild protests. It's Martin Luther King's hometown, and Atlanta kind of prides itself on being progressive in dealing with protests, but not anymore. So we've been seeing, even just demonstrations that you wouldn't expect there to be any arrests at, 18, 19 arrests, sometimes within a few nights of each other. But things have been pretty tame in the past month or so, but there's just this sense that things could get crazy at any minute. It feels like there's a tension that anything could go down, and looking towards the election that's happening in less than a week, I think everybody's got the sense that nobody knows what's going to happen.
Hey, this is Susan from Grand Rapids area. Yeah, I think our big night was May 30th, that Saturday, which it felt like, we were all sharing space in the streets throughout the country that night in many ways. And, I guess just historically looking at our town, specifically amateur strike of 1911, and then in Detroit, 1967, riots popped off and kind of spilled over, so Detroit's on the east side and the west side of the state. That stuff definitely spilled over into our town. We're the second largest city in the state. And I remember thinking that night, I was like, wow, this is the third big thing, of the recent, quote, recent time. What felt so striking to me, I guess, was we don't really have a left in Western Michigan and in Northern Michigan and Southern Michigan. Detroit kind of has something, but by and large, things are really raw, as a lot of people have seen with Lansing and, the militias that we have going on here. You're either conservative, gun-toting, or you're just pretty straightforward radical. And so that was an interesting thing to see that night here in particular, was seeing folks just gather around. There was a protest called for that night. We would see floods of people coming into downtown, and a lot of younger people with signs and everything. I was like, okay, this is cool. Maybe something neat will happen. At that point we were thinking people will write with chalk or something on the sidewalk, or have a banner, or heaven forbid, go in the street. We weren't really expecting that much. And I forget the organization that originally hosted the protest earlier in the day wanted some sort of solemn, silent protest that, was very respectful, dignified, and very peaceful, was the language around it. And, maybe if we were kind of a different town that we're more accustomed to protests that, went off the sidewalk. Like, we haven't seen that since the Iraq War days, or like since Bush would be in town or something like that. So it had been a while since anything of significance had happened here. A little bit maybe around Occupy, but there were thousands and thousands of people that just flooded the downtown area. Like, I didn't even know where all these people came from. And primarily younger people. And, there were so many of us, like, it had to spill into the streets, definitely could not be sustained on the sidewalk. And that's a pretty big deal for here. And, folks all, for the most part, centered around the police department building downtown, and just were chanting, kind of going nuts, getting rowdy, rowdy as far as like banging on trash cans, banging on stop signs, things like that, nothing too crazy yet. And like, it was like when night fell, something just switched with people. I didn't see it go down myself, but I remember stepping away for a moment. I was like, oh, someone just, spray painted decolonize across the entire police station building, which this building holds the Secretary of State, which is our DMV, and I think a parole office as well, and the police department. So it's like a government building, and that's a pretty big deal. And I was like, wow, that's huge. Like, I've lived here 17 years. I've never seen someone do something like that downtown at a protest. And then it was like a signal call or something, like just something flipped. And, people were pulling trash cans, dumpsters, everything all into this main intersection in our downtown area that quadrants out the city, and then lit them on fire, and then brought in banners and signs and just like any kind of material thing that was disposable, just created this beautiful barricade right in the heart, in the center of the city, right in front of the police department. And there was chanting, and after a while, motorcycles coming by, then sideshows going on, and just all these elements. It was like, what? Like, this normally doesn't happen here. And it just progressed and progressed. And then you heard the first window break, and it was one after another, after another, after another, after another. And there was not one standing window left in our downtown area. Over $2 million worth of damage done. And these are like high-end boutiques. These are not chains. I think the only chain business downtown was Starbucks. So government buildings, bridal boutiques, jewelry stores, sushi restaurants, really fancy stuff, just getting hit left and right. And there was like quibbles and conflicts within those moments and in that space occasionally. But by and large, there was just so much joy. And like, I don't know, I can't even put words to it, but just, thinking like, wow, this is a moment none of us here have ever experienced before within our lifetimes, or generation, I should say. And there was one arrest that night. What followed after that is, we've had some really high-end charges, but it's only been for a handful of people. Following that, though, there has been backlash, and people have said, well, we can't let that happen again. We need to, be more refined with our protests and, keep things together and not let that happen again. But I mean, it was just absolutely unprecedented for our area.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing folks involved in anti-repression work from Grand Rapids, Salt Lake City, Madison, Atlanta, and Seattle. I appreciate hearing little bits of the wonder coming out in people's voices when they're like, I've never seen the city like this, or talking about the scale of mutual aid projects in their area. Like, I'm imagining that people in the listening audience are going to have people are going to have like a bunch of different experiences, like being in big cities, being small rural towns, being in like middling suburbs, and they're going to get a lot from hearing the emotion and the experience that people have. So I've heard little bits about the way that the local, state, or federal governments have responded to the rebellion differently in different places. For instance, like federal charges for, I believe you said federal charges for purchasing paint in Salt Lake City, right?
Yes, that is correct.
That's fucking insane.
Or wait, sorry. Life in prison for buying paint in Salt Lake City.
Oh my God. Yeah, I was wondering, could you all talk about sort of after the rebellion sparked off or as it continued, the sorts of charges that people started facing? I know you've talked about like numbers of arrests on different days, but sort of paint a picture of how things have been coalescing, maybe visible or surprising signs of coordination between various levels of law enforcement. For instance, I remember in Seattle, hearing about in Seattle, folks getting held on local charges and then that getting picked up by the feds. Or in Madison, there's been grand jury. I'm not sure if that's federal grand jury or state level, but if you could talk about like what sort of responses and repression has looked like in your area, that would be good to hear.
I can jump in and real quick go over some of the stuff that's been happening in the Seattle area. This is Charlie from PSPS. So since May 28th, there have been about 500 arrests of people in demonstrations. We have 9 federal arrests in the area so far. But what's really interesting for us is that a very, 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 very small number of people have been charged currently. We have a prosecutor's office, and this particular prosecutor named Satterberg, who is very much in that vein of like the liberal prosecutor. And so early on in the rebellion, he said he wasn't going to charge people for peaceful actions at demonstrations, which presents like a really, really big challenge in the fact that that's not a legal designation whatsoever. And this is a thing that we've been talking to people about a lot, is that what we're seeing here is that people are arrested and then they've used a variety of tactics to try and hold people in jail for as long as humanly possible. You know, they've used some tactics like arresting people on a felony hold, which they have a certain amount of time before they have to charge you on a felony here. And, you know, at the last moment with which they can decide to charge a felony or not, they choose to release those charges from the felony court. And then 4 hours later, before the person has been released, they'll say, actually, we want to charge them with a misdemeanor. And so the whole process starts over again. And so, you know, for a really basic charge that, you know, everyone understands they're not going to be prosecuted. People are basically being held for, you know, upwards of 3 days on these really minor misdemeanor charges at the same time as there's an open COVID outbreak in our county jail. And that's been a really big concern for us. So what we talked about with people here is looking at the charges that haven't been filed, not as being dismissed or dropped, because I think those are sometimes really legal misunderstandings from a layman's terms, and look at them as charges that have not been filed yet. Satterberg's office, the prosecutor's office, has sometimes 3 to 5 years to file these felony charges. And our history as a crew in the last 5 years here in Seattle has been that even on some very minor misdemeanor stuff, Satterberg's office will wait 1 to 2 years on a misdemeanor to charge people. You know, this happened with a bunch of people who did a lockdown, I think with Greenpeace or something. He waited 2 years, I think, to charge people and then charged them with like pedestrian interference. And so we're really hoping that this doesn't happen, but we're talking to folks about this idea that, you know, several hundred people have been given charges that they could come back with in the future. Inside of that dynamic of Satterberg being this progressive, you know, liberal prosecutor who's going to, you know, be really fair to BIPOC communities and all that garbage, was the fact that the Seattle Police Department was arresting people and then not getting the results that they were looking for in those arrests in terms of charges. And at some point in the process, either SPD or the Western Washington District Attorney General prosecutor jumped the hierarchy, and arrests started to circumvent Satterberg's office completely and get picked up by the Fed. And so we were seeing people arrested, and, you know, we've had a handful of arrests that have gone federal that had started out at state level, but, you know, it took weeks. And then more recently, we're seeing people, as opposed to a week's span, we find out about an arrest, and within half an hour, they've been picked up by the feds instead, and the charges never landed on Satterberg or the state level's desk. And the big issue there, and this has been brought up by lawyers here, is that the charges are kind of the same. The charges are kind of the same regardless, but the penalties at the federal level are much, 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 much higher. So the federal charges that we have are almost entirely based on damage to police vehicles, precincts, or firearms charges. And so these could be prosecuted at the state level. We're not saying they should be, but like if they were prosecuted at the state level, the ramifications of these arrests would be much less. And we also have a really intense COVID outbreak in SeaTac, FDC, in the Federal Detention Center here in Seattle. So all of the people that are still in federal detention that we're supporting, we're specifically worried about them catching COVID while under federal detention. So what we're seeing is SPD backed by their union, which the union itself has been, and the union hall, much like in Portland, has been attacked multiple times by demonstrations and by nighttime attacks, has particularly really pushed a kind of law and order narrative that's being trumpeted, up and down the coast and across the country by different police unions, but they're really rallying against this idea of the liberal prosecutor who's not charging people, when in fact Satterberg's office is charging people, and these 500 folks have pending charges that really could ruin their lives.
Yeah, the Immigrant Detention Center, or the Federal Detention Center just south of Atlanta, is also having a COVID outbreak. And we've got people there who are now writing us saying, please send us masks. They're not taking precautions to take care of us. We've had some people there that were arrested in Gainesville, just like an hour north of Atlanta, right at the beginning of the George Floyd protests, who've been in there this whole time. And now there are 3 more people that just got put in there on Wednesday as the result of some raids and new federal charges that just happened. So there were 2 house raids on Wednesday by some combination of ATF, Homeland Security, FBI, and Atlanta Police Department, some special task force, according to the people that were raided. And these are felony charges that we think are resulting from the Wendy's fire after the Rayshard Brooks killing in June. So federal charges just coming down. So we're waiting to see if more shoes drop with that. So now these 3 new people have just been put in this COVID-ridden facility. So a lot heavier repression than we're used to seeing in Atlanta. Even with the really minor charges, you're used to protesters. Sure, you might get arrested for pedestrian and roadway, but you'll be out later that night oftentimes. And Atlanta's got this supposedly progressive mayor and progressive city council, and they recently passed a bail reform to get rid of cash bail in minor charges. But now what we're seeing with these protests is protesters are being charged with the exception to those charges that don't carry bail. So you do have to wait in jail overnight because you're charged with something that maybe does have bail. So you have to wait in jail overnight, go to a bail hearing in the morning or afternoon, and then they'll presumably set your bail at just a signature bond and you can get out. But you're staying in that COVID-ridden jail overnight. And this includes everybody that's arrested, whether you've got cancer, whether you're elderly. So that's what's been happening with almost all of the protesters, particularly lately. I think at the very beginning, Atlanta didn't have its whole protest repression strategy outlined, and they were letting people out the same night or later that night. But since then, it's been pretty consistent. In fact, the latest batch of arrests that happened, the 19 that were arrested at the end of September, several of them had to wait in jail 2 nights because suddenly there wasn't court on Saturday. There was on Sunday. So they were in that facility for that whole time. I guess I could also say, so Atlanta has seen over 800 protest arrests since May. and 65 of them are felonies. Some of them are quite heavy felonies, arson, things like that.
Here in Salt Lake City, we have around 100 arrests, I want to say, and 3 federal cases. And as far as like the overlaps in some of the different departments and the way that people have experienced repression, I guess more of what we've seen is, even though there were like over 100 people arrested, only a few people have been charged as well. So it's been really interesting, just kind of like waiting to see who gets charged. I think another overlap that we've seen here is specifically on like the kind of charges that people are experiencing, right? They were trying to charge people with gang enhancements because they were trying to say that the support crew for Bernardo, who was murdered, they are now a gang. So that's I think the most bizarre thing that we've really seen more than anything.
This is Liam from Madison. Yeah, we did have some grand jury subpoenas happen, and this is part of the education I was undergoing doing grand jury support. But the grand jury, at least here in Madison, meets, stays meeting all the time, the federal grand jury, like once a month. I think they've pretty much always been convened, not necessarily the same jury, a group of folks on the jury, but they're always doing something or another, but they're not always focusing on protest movements. And of course, when the federal grand jury focuses and targets protest movements, they have special powers to spread suspicion, unlike, a regular jury does. And so we had federal grand jury subpoenas happen to folks who were involved in the movement here in Madison. I think one of the first ones in the country, and I believe the first ones in the country to have that. And, the education we were doing is, for federal grand juries, they can subpoena someone who they suspect knows someone who did something that they want to seek an indictment for, and they can also subpoena somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who did something they want to seek an indictment for, and I believe one more step as well. And so we have 500,000 people here in the metropolitan area. And, the movement is obviously not that big, but it was very huge. We had 10,000 people come out that first Saturday, which was beautiful. Burning cop car happened here in Madison, first time since 1993. That was great. But anyways, the federal grand jury has the ability to sort of spread distrust and fear amongst the entire activist community here in Madison. But it's kind of interesting, though, because a lot of folks don't understand that about federal grand juries, about how exactly they maneuver to suppress movements. And so that was part of what we were doing for grand jury support work here in Madison, was to try to educate folks. So they ended up subpoenaing 3 folks, and one of them ended up going to jail for, I believe it's called contempt, because he refused to testify in front of the grand jury. And then he ended up, I guess, talking, Jesse Shackelford, and got out of jail pretty quickly, a few days. And after that happened, that resulted in exactly what, they're designed to do and what you fear they do, which is everybody's suspicious of this person and that person, etc. So yeah, then I also wanted to talk about how the repression from the law enforcement agencies of various levels happened in Madison, because in Madison, it's super liberal progressive for we have a history of uprisings in the late 60s around stopping the war in Vietnam and the college here and everything. And so the police never act like they do in Chicago and New York or a number of other cities. They always do this purple glove type of maneuvering where they're doing negotiated management with protests and protest movements, where they try to get in buddy with organizers and organize with them. Even if you don't get a permit, they'll show up with their cop cars and pretend they're, if you're taking the streets, they'll go and block traffic allegedly to keep you safe, even if you don't have a permit. That's just a standard thing they do, even though they'll block traffic, but they always conveniently leave enough space. So they're just looking like they're blocking traffic to keep us safe. Because we've had I'm sure y'all have had it too, but we've had couple dozen, if not 3 dozen different people hitting protesters with their cars. It's like so commonplace now. It's like ridiculous. And, the cops always leave space for that. But anyway, so we didn't see any arrests at any protests the first week, except for like one person who was doing graffiti, ironically, on space on a board that the city was paying other people to do graffiti on. Like they paid artists, and then this one kid at a protest did some graffiti and the cops arrested him. So yeah, what we're seeing is the cops doing the kid glove, purple glove, negotiated management tactics with movements where they try to act like they're helping us, they're on our side. And then later on, they do investigations, and then they go and they arrest people, and they're contacting folks, and they've been successful at getting several people to sort of like talk, thinking that it was in their best interest, and which ended up in other people getting charged with things like for pulling down the statues here and for looting, aka burglary, they call it allegedly. And then there's this one special situation. The city county building here got allegedly firebombed. And so they have like a really grainy traffic camera picture of somebody throwing like an improvised alleged Molotov cocktail type of device. And they've used that for so much repression over and over again. And they've like in the media, and they've alleged that it was like several different people now at this point, 3 people. So yeah, we have one person named Marquand Clark who's currently in jail on a revocation of his parole, who's they're trying to charge. That's the new person they're going to charge with that. There was so what happens is they don't arrest people at protests, barely. They wait till afterwards. We have like 2 dozen folks who are like have been arrested in conjunction with the protest here. And then also the ATF is also like getting involved in investigating the alleged firebombing, the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, the federal agency. And they've used that firebomb for ammunition, I guess, to get a lot of different people to talk to them because they're spreading a lot of fear with that firebombing. And it's really just a BS, like grainy picture. You can't tell who the heck it is, someone in generic clothes. And so I wanted to mention quickly, there was 2 people that got arrested at protests. There was the one youth, and then there was later on another older black gentleman named Dwayne Thomas, and he was arrested for allegedly doing graffiti too. And it was really tragic because they actually tortured him. They put him in solitary confinement. They put a bag over his head and they locked him to a chair overnight. And he was in on like some misdemeanor stuff, and we were trying to bail him out. We paid bail, but he was being tortured, so they weren't able to release him. And they were saying, oh, he didn't cooperate with the bail process, like he didn't sign his bail papers, which is a common like excuse that we hear from the sheriff for them to detain people for longer whenever they are targeting the movement. And so he's seeking to, look at some legal representation for try to sue the city for civil rights abuses for that torture case.
Yeah, as far as Grand Rapids goes and like legal retaliation, we have not had any federal cases that we know of yet. And I don't think anywhere else in Michigan right now. Like I mentioned earlier, our handful, it's like between 16 or 19 folks with pretty high-end, multiple felonies. The biggest thing we've been dealing with here is having to pay like post bond in full. So for example, we spent like $60,000 on one person, and numbers have been close to that as well. So not a percentage, just, are really pushing us through the ringer with that sort of thing. And then the charges carrying very long sentences. Something else that's strange and maybe kind of more small town feeling is the police department here has been posting on social media these things called Wanted Wednesdays, where they post footage or stills of people from the 30th here and, are like, hey, who are these folks? And it's been really sad. Like certain people's grandparents have, turned in their grandkids. And it's just a pretty depressing situation with that sort of thing. Beyond that, we just have a pretty small amount of defendants with really high charges. So we'll see where this goes. I mean, folks aren't really coming from any sort of, like I mentioned, we don't really have a a leftist movement or like groups here in town. So, some people are homeless or, have like very precarious living situations. And it's really hard to go through this process with folks, especially folks we don't know to begin with, and try to offer support in that way. And yeah, like immigration statuses are being held against people, things like that. So far, it seems like people haven't really talked, which is great. There might be a situation where someone not intentionally did, but yeah, there is an interest, in co-defendants having each other's backs. But the cases themselves are so unique and separated from each other. There aren't really crews of people getting arrested. It's more like, a home getting raided or someone getting stopped on the street, which is really intimidating.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
What's up, y'all? I'm Pearson, host of Coffee with Comrades. Coffee with Comrades is rooted in militant joy. Our hope is to cultivate a warm and inviting atmosphere, like walking into your favorite coffee shop to sit down with some of your close friends and share a heart-to-heart conversation. New episodes premiere every Tuesday, so be sure to smash that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. We are proud to be a part of the Channel Zero network.
It's notable that a few of you have been talking about footage being brought up in order to bring charges. Like, for instance, those the federal grand juries not only being repressive tools, but they're also investigatory as a way of building a case before an indictment occurs. So since a lot of these arrests aren't actually happening in the moment, they're happening after the fact, I wonder if anyone would care to talk about the impacts of the way that particularly so many young people who are new to protest movements, who are coming into the streets, and also who are coming along with their existing relationship to social media or to their phones or to streaming, how you've seen this sort of impact the cases in your area?
This is Earthworm from Atlanta. I think it's unclear how many people have been snitching or if anybody's been snitching, but that's sort of part of the game that they play. And in these two recent house raids that I mentioned where federal agents were there, they were interrogating the people who lived there, and they were hinting that somebody had snitched. So I don't know. I could certainly entirely believe that somebody has. I mean, they are professionals and they're highly trained at manipulating people and intimidating people and getting them to talk, but they could also just very easily be sowing intimidation and doubt and mistrust. So it's not really something that we can act on, without more solid information. What I will say is the Atlanta Solidarity Fund will not provide any funding for anybody that we know is cooperating with authorities to get somebody else in trouble. It's a tough call because there's, intimidation, there's torture, there's people get arrested and maybe they're a kid or maybe they're just brand new and the police are working on their heads and convincing them to talk. But the bottom line is, whatever reason somebody has for snitching on somebody else, we can't be supporting that. So that's a hard one.
You're asking about surveillance from live footage and stuff like that. That's come up a couple times because there's been a couple articles where folks were identified and pictures were taken from folks' live feeds, and then they were printed in the paper to track those folks down. So yeah, that's definitely been used. But then at the same time, I was talking to a National Lawyers Guild lawyer here in town, and he said that all the protests have been happening in the central sort of commercial and state government area down in the Capitol Square, Madison, and they have that place so heavily surveilled. He says that it doesn't matter if you are doing live videos or not, because, folks get mad when people are doing live videos, I think justifiably so. But then again, there is the fact that there was that grainy footage that they have of the city county building, so it's obvious they don't really have that great a surveillance. Yeah, the National Lawyers Guild person was saying they have like cameras, they can see super high resolution right in the middle of the night. And then, yeah, I also was going to add earlier, and now it's kind of relevant as well, like how the state law enforcement agencies are targeting different people like strategically, because they're targeting folks. Well, obviously they're targeting Black leaders. They did that from the get-go, folks who are obviously like, leading the protests here and there. And that's kind of like also a good place to plug, like leaderless movements are so important, right? So that the state can't target people for repression. But then also they have been targeting folks and questioning folks who have children, and then also like folks who are known to have mental health conditions that sort of would make it harder for them to spend time in jail, etc. That's been very deliberate on their part, who they're targeting to get to talk to other folks. And it's true, we don't have a lot of evidence that folks are talking, although we do have like at least one where like a discovery has been done by a lawyer, and it came out that somebody actually did talk. And then Jesse Shackelford talking has sort of been confirmed in a lot of different ways, like, but there's no like real evidence, obviously. And you can never have that with grand juries because all of the proceedings are secret. And then real quick, I forgot to add that the grand jury, if you refuse to testify when you're subpoenaed, you can spend up to 18 months in jail. And so that's like another tactic that they use the grand jury to get people to talk and to sow a lot of suspicion and, and fear in movements.
Yeah, here we've had, just in terms of social media, multiple cases of folks who were allegedly live streaming or texting during a moment, and, posting that on social media. And that's what they end up getting popped for. We also had a situation where, just in terms of like bond violation agreements, someone was like allegedly posing with a firearm in a picture, and like, they went after that person like immediately, like quicker than I think they normally would for that sort of thing. So just want to say they're definitely watching everything that people are putting up there before, during, and after the fact.
Yeah, here in Seattle. Okay, I have a lot to say on this topic, so again, I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. Our job as an anti-repression group is not only to help people get out of jail and pick people up and make sure they get to where they're going and yada yada, but it's partially to like look at the big picture and try and notice trends. And Seattle is a really intense web of surveillance networks, and they're all kind of working together at the moment. There's a heavy emphasis in these charging documents at both the state and the federal level with a reliance on video evidence. Sometimes that comes from the surveillance net that is put up over the downtown and Capitol Hill area of Seattle. Sometimes that is information pulled from live streams. Sometimes it's a combination of the two. Sometimes it's information pulled from individuals' social media. But what they've been primarily doing, and one of the reasons that our crew has such a strong aversion to videoing and live streaming demonstrations, regardless of their like direct action potential, is that the state is pulling together and extrapolating bits of information from a variety of sources until they get a break. There have been a couple of cases, especially some of our federal cases, where the state spent 3 months building a case against an individual by singling them out using public security cameras, from May 29th, for instance, singling an individual out from security cameras and following them throughout that demonstration. They were able to follow this person using public cameras throughout the demonstration. And then when they, SPD or whoever decided that they did whatever illegal act that they did, they became a target. And so they built this narrative around this person when they were lacking the final piece of information. And in a lot of these cases, the final piece of information is the FBI or SPD putting someone's photo up and being like, do you know who this person is? And that person being snitched out. And in that moment, when they've got a name to associate with this individual, they're able to go back and then fill in all the gaps for themselves. And so they can go back into other avenues. For instance, in one case, they were able to see that in someone's pocket was a cell phone. And when they had this person's name, they subpoenaed their cloud, their iCloud, basically. They subpoenaed their Apple Cloud and were given access to all of their information, which the state is saying has incriminating evidence inside of it, at the same time as they use the information from the location of that phone to put that individual at that demonstration. And so there are so many avenues with which the state is using to repress people at the moment. We have a lot of concern around the heavy use of individuals' phones, Telegram, especially open telegrams, and live streams in the way in which maybe not one of those individual acts has given the state the information that they need. But when they lay them all on top of each other, it connects all the dots. And it's done that for at least for a case for them to try and bring charges. And it's done that in a couple of scenarios in ways with which if an individual hadn't been filming that night, possibly the charges would never have been able to come together in the way the state has made them able to come together. A thing that we're also seeing here, and other people have mentioned a little bit that concerns us, is the way in which the SPD, at least the local police, have now begun these kind of like large attacks on a demonstration that's not very big, 20 to 40 people. We have a demonstration here every night, and then detains a huge number of that demonstration and brings them all to the precinct, IDs all of them, and then lets them go. And so as this has been happening more and more and more, there's a concern about a framework being built from the local police department of trying to identify people from demonstrations, regardless of how well they're addressed, based on the fact that they've had so much contact with them. And this, coupled with an over-reliance on social media personalities, I would say, in order to coordinate these demonstrations, leaves a lot of concern for the repressive elements that could be seeping into those fissures, if that all makes sense. I think TLDR, we don't like live streams or cameras at demonstrations because the capacity for the state to repress people is beyond our technical capacity to circumvent. And so we just say that they shouldn't be there.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing folks involved in anti-repression work from Grand Rapids, Salt Lake City, Madison, Atlanta, and Seattle. We're having this conversation, again, just to sort of intercede in the run-up to the presidential election in the U.S., which a lot of people are probably going to be in the streets from the far right, from the far left. There's going to be there's already started to be ramping up towards government repression. For instance, National Guard being mobilized to be prepared for Philly, and Philly's also been rising up because of police violence. So I'm hoping that this conversation will be helpful as folks start or continue their thinking towards how do we support people being in the streets, and as people catch charges and as they possibly go away for years, even on some bullshit. But so one thing that I was hoping that you all could comment on is if you've seen any instances, and if you haven't, this is wonderful, but if you've seen any instances where liberal groups, progressive groups, or even ostensibly radical groups have leveraged their relationship around the demonstrations with people in power in order to co-opt motion or to throw people under the bus. There's definitely been instances where organizations ostensibly on the left, or calling themselves on the left, or part of BLM in some instances, because BLM is so many different things in so many different places, that have told people not to go into the streets in response to police killings, or have talked about coordinating with law enforcement to stop quote-unquote outside agitators or out-of-town anarchists, or whatever terminology they want to use, to stymie participation in demonstrations and to control the narratives of what resistance looks like, as well as positioning themselves in relation to existent power. So I'm wondering if you have any examples that you've seen doing anti-repression work during this round of uprisings over the summer where you've experienced something like that, and any sort of takeaways that might be helpful to others around that.
Well, it's definitely happened. There's new groups. I don't want to name them because they're also youth led and, Black youth led. And, they are showing up in the streets, but they're also sort of like trying to take a lot of energy away from the streets, at least indirectly, towards lobbying, and also like tend to police folks who do things like graffiti or sort of property destruction at their events, which kind of sucks the energy out of what could be, a really rebellious situation a lot of times. And you'll have that. There's the Police Civilian Oversight Board that has sort of, I don't know if it's sucked a lot of energy from the grassroots, but at least a little bit. And of course, that's probably most likely going to be toothless, just like all police civilian oversight boards. So I see that as a big, like a big mistake for the movement. But also it's like, I'm just so used to these things happening where it's like not a surprise. But nothing particularly outstanding or incredulous that I can think of besides like those two.
This is Earthworm from Atlanta. I think we have in the past, like with the previous Black Lives Matter manifestations, seen people sort of more or less cynically trying to turn a movement into a career. And that, of course, has implications for what types of actions they're willing to support or trying to repress. And we've seen definitely cynical attempts to capitalize on Black Lives Matter name recognition and had people just making money off of it. But I think those cases have been the exception. It's been pretty impressive how cohesive things have been here.
Here in Seattle, there has been a really intense attempt, and we saw this a lot around the Chaz, for our progressive liberal bullshit mayor, Jenny Durkin, to sow a lot of discontent and push a really strong narrative of disunity amongst people participating in the rebellion. And there is a lot of disunity amongst people participating in the rebellion. But there's an overarching understanding that I think things have really shifted from a rebellion into a more consistent and like rhythmic protest movement. And I have the capacity to explode back into that rebellion, I think. But when the rebellion was in full swing, in a real sense, there's a lot of understanding that there are multiple ways in which people rebel. And the individuals, and mostly it was individuals and not organizations, that rose to try and to megaphone, and swoop the like rebellious energy, especially of like BIPOC youth, got easily shouted down. And they're not gone necessarily. And I think the movement itself is like coming to reckon with itself in terms of how to deal with that. But the individuals that attempted to gain notoriety and push a specific kind of narrative, whether it was peace or nonviolence, in the end sparked a lot more conversation on what is violence. Like, is trying to take down the construction site of a juvenile detention center violence? And overwhelmingly, it seemed like the left in Seattle said, no, it's not violence. Caging children is violence. And so I think the attempts at the city to sow this discontent amongst the ranks of the people who are out in the streets has resoundingly failed. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of conflict and not a lot of conversations about tactics and how to move forward. And there's a lot more of that, I think, around the Chaz. But I would say that the ways in which different disparate groups here in Seattle have shown up for each other has been really incredible and helped, I think, create a space with which the city and the state and the feds have lacked entry points to really like push that like discontent from within narrative. And I think it's why they're relying so heavily on this kind of outside agitator model, is because they can't get the different BIPOC communities to fight amongst each other openly in that way. And that's really what the state wants, right?
Yeah, I think we had a situation here where like the police chief definitely tried to identify like people pretty aggressively, a broad range of folks that they could like nominate as leaders and be in touch with, and really, I think the GRPD really propped up the day after the night of the riots as like, this is the morning where we go and clean up our city, from all this like trash that went down the night before, and let's sweep up the glass, let's board up the windows. Like, that's not us. That's not who we are. That's not Grand Rapids. And, the mayor to police chief to, different prominent city leaders just like really leaned in on that and stifled a lot of not just conversations, but just like people who were planning protests, following the week of, the initial uprising. Like, it was just like that was the dominant narrative, and people were being tokenized and used, and some people very willingly enjoyed that position of leadership that was newly bestowed onto them, or in the past they had been around for a bit, as like just identifying, like, we're doing the moral correct thing here. What happened that night is an anomaly. Like, that's never going to happen again in this town.
I really relate to the feeling like, that's an anomaly, right? Like, it's never going to happen again. I think a lot of us felt that when the protests first, started, especially because the first day was so heavy and so long that we were like, okay, is this it? And then they just never stopped, right? Well, here we're just, we don't get a lot of protests like big like that. So the last one that we had was about a year ago, and it was over some local environmental stuff that we have going on. They're trying to build an inland port, and we've been fighting it. Since we're such a small city, it's the same people doing the environmental climate justice shit. We're the same people doing immigration shit, the same people doing racial justice work. We all wear many hats. But during that protest a year ago, what happened was a line was drawn because the protest got really, really, really big, really violent, violent in the eyes of the state, right? and a few of the homies of the compas were arrested. And so then it seemed like there was two kinds of protesters that, it wasn't born in that moment, but it was definitely like a line was drawn, right? There was the line of the protesters that were against that protest, and the line of the protesters who were not into that protest, who were not for it. And the protest was so big that some of the folks got some riot charges over it, which we were all super surprised. We really didn't think it was going to happen like that. And the governor here, he said it was like, this is the worst protest I've ever seen. I've never seen it so uncivilized. It was borderline terrorism. So then, we had some local majority older folks who had been doing protests in their opinion, right? They would tell us, we do protest the right way. and we do we know civility. And meanwhile, we had all of us that, we're the raggedy anarchist queers, whatever. We're like, well, who cares? Like, we're trying to support our community. We're not going to vilify people that are getting arrested. That makes no sense, right? So from that dynamic, we've been, fast forward a year, we've been kind of dealing with the aftermath of that, and we've definitely seen the lines drawn. We've definitely seen like some people are just so against, not protesting the right way. And then you have other people, and they're just like, well, what the fuck is even the right way to, to have a demonstration, right? Like, we're just trying to show up for each other, more than nothing. So yeah, that's what we've seen. We've definitely seen people try to co-opt things, try to say that they know the right way to protest or whatever. But I mean, I don't know. One of the homies is facing charges. His brother was murdered by police, a few years ago, and he's an indigenous brother. Him and I went to a few actions a few years ago, and I'll talk to him, and he'll just say like, if they're, I don't understand. I'm just showing up for my rage. I'm showing up for my lived experience, And honestly, I think that's where it's at for a lot of us here, is we're trying to show up for each other across the spectrums of rage and grief and despair and righteous anger.
Like I mentioned before, and I think a few folks have mentioned, we're building up to another pressure point when there's bound to be more conflict in the streets. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about are things that people have had to relearn multiple times in their communities, as things have ebbed and flowed, as people have learned and forgotten some lessons. But so for folks that are out there who are recently engaged in politics and street politics, they're maybe like they've got a crew or they've got a community that they're working with, and they are going to be building infrastructure. They're going to be like reaching out, building connections, and and doing social justice work more widely. Are there any notes that you want to pass them about lessons around anti-repression tactics or building alliances like the strong ones that most of you talked about existing despite government intervention? Sort of like messaging or any other things that like you've seen come up as mistakes either where you are or elsewhere, things that we can learn from when trying to build stronger communities, a stronger like culture of resistance, and more ability, more capacity for resistance and thriving?
Yeah, I think that we need to all learn about these federal grand juries and like how they operate. They're complicated and they're sneaky and they're horrible. And then also when there's conflicts, folks go to like Facebook and post things, intra-movement conflicts between folks in the movement. And I think that helps the state surveil us and recognize weak points, and that we should be striving to like deal with intra-movement conflicts, like I guess in person as much as possible. I know that's hard, but yeah, don't put it out there for the state to kind of like use that against us and help them with their strategy of repression. I would say two things.
Yeah, that sounds like basic security culture training. And I would emphasize that organizers should put a lot of effort into holding trainings and getting people trained on things like security culture and knowing your rights in dealing with the police. There are know your rights trainings that you can come to your city and give, but everybody will tell you, yeah, I already know my rights, because everybody thinks they already know their rights. But that doesn't always translate into being able to keep your mouth shut when police or the FBI are staring you down and asking you questions. So we got to increase the understanding of what knowing your rights means and be continually giving those trainings. Security culture, cop watch, how to do jail support. The second thing I would say is we need to continue building the support roles, right? We need to be holding medic trainings. We need to be doing increasing jail support, legal support. And those like support roles are what makes the ongoing protest possible. And it's such a long haul now that the normal people who, we kind of take for granted are the ones that do these things are burning out. So we need to be getting new volunteers in all those efforts. So holding trainings is a part of that. And an exciting thing about, how organizing has been going lately is that you can do that with people that aren't even necessarily in your city. So we could start building networks of people from different cities who can help with the support roles when something's going on in one city. We've got people from somebody's in Bali that helps out with the Atlanta jail support effort, different countries, different states. And we've been building that network, and we can do the same. We can return the favor when something's going down in those other cities. So I think it's exciting to think about different ways that we can collaborate in different places and build like maybe one big court support network or jail support network.
Yeah, I think here in Michigan, in a lot of ways, we're a peninsula, not an island entirely, but we have our own culture and our own terrain. And I recognize that other people hold that as well. We're not really influenced that much, though, by other people's traditions and ways of doing things as far as support roles go. And the basics, sure, but I really like that we've been able to kind of craft that in our own way and sort of build that up and do it as we go and learn over the years on how to improve that and make it better. Like I've mentioned before, we don't really have a large activist community or really many activist people at all. We live in shit towns here. Sorry if I can't say that, but yeah, we've just kind of figured out what made sense. And I think what I would want to say is just, you can do this too. If you're in a crappy town, you can do it too. And that's going to take on its own flavor and way of existing. And it's best for the place you live in. So borrow the things that make sense from outside and create new stuff for yourself and learn how to implement that.
Charlie over in Seattle. Yeah, I think that a lot of things have gone extraordinarily well here, and the outpouring of support for people facing repression has been like incredible. But we've also all made a lot of mistakes, like as a movement. You know, of course, like my group is not above that. We joke a lot about how anarchists do really good jail support and like anti-repression work because we're just kind of constantly going to jail or being repressed. And I think that there's a couple of points that I've been thinking about and we've been talking about a lot is that in terms of the people who are facing a lot of the repression that we're seeing, you know, not everybody's connected to a larger crew or to the left really at all. It's a lot of like young BIPOC folks who have experienced like extreme systemic police interactions and police violence, but haven't gone through political repression. And so the folks who are in the streets are in the streets because they're tired of being targeted by the police in these kind of like day-to-day systemic interactions, but it's their first real jump into that becoming their politics and that shaping their politics. And so we've been talking a lot about like trying to like push the newer and younger generations of folks to look towards older political movements about political repression because it can and look differently than people who are used to on the ground level street violence from the police and the state. Like, you know, the World of Revolt that was created in the 60s and 70s like created a huge framework for political repression, and the state has outpaced a lot of the older modalities that we have for our organizing against it. One of those things that we're seeing right now is like really talking about wanting to go back to building a security culture and one that's not necessarily heavily emphasized by tech. Clearly with COVID and all of us being isolated and locked down from each other, everyone has gravitated towards using tech solutions in a lot of ways. But a thing that we're seeing is that the culture of building affinity has been replaced in some instances with more loose vetting processes and more loose conversations about like, you know, well, my stuff is encrypted, so we can just talk about whatever, but we just met each other. And so really wanting to go back to understanding that like a culture of security is one of care and one of affinity and one of long-standing solidarity with each other. And so those are kind of some of the overarching things. I think for all of us doing anti-repression work, we don't really want to be doing anti-repression work because we don't want there to be repression to be organizing against. And so thinking like maybe a couple of steps ahead is important for us. And then just last real quick things about like speaking directly to people who are going to be in the streets for the election is, you know, I think everyone will agree that you have a plan that you can share with your close group of people where everyone knows your wishes and your wants if you are to get arrested and the background things are taken care of and you've got somebody to come pick you up from jail. The anti-repression groups and the jail support groups that are going to be out next week are going to be pushed to the brink most likely. You know, we're going to possibly see a level of unrest that we can't possibly necessarily support in total. So community stepping in to take care of itself is going to be really important. And a point that I like to point out, our work as jail support and as an anti-repression group is consent-based. And so we strive really hard, work really hard to keep information about, you know, defendants and people who are arrested in mind in that case. So when someone is arrested, think about what kind of consent you've gotten from them to share their information publicly. Think about the conversations that you've already had, or if you can't get consent from someone to share their information publicly after they've been arrested, think about what it means to transgress that line and the pros and cons of that, because people are, with the best intentions, putting a lot of information out into the world that I think has the capacity to be used against people in the future, either by the state or the right, which clearly, as we're seeing, is one and the same more and more every day. So those are just some points that I've been thinking about a lot, and we have been thinking about a lot as a group.
More than anything, I guess what I would offer is, you know, when the uprising started, we didn't have a bail fund. we were basically, you know, a group chat of people checking in with each other, you know, asking each other like who knows a lawyer, you know. And now, fast forward several months later, not only do we have a bail fund, but we also have a National Lawyers Guild crew. We have local crews mobilizing, and I think a lot of that goes back to it can happen anywhere. Just like repression can happen anywhere. I hear that a lot locally, that people with heavy charges, they tell me, I never thought it would happen here, and it's well, as fascism happens everywhere, I think that also means that anti-fascism is going to happen everywhere, right? So be ready for it happening in your streets, be ready for it happening in the small towns, and be ready for rebellion to spring up in the most unusual, unthinkable places. I've seen some pretty beautiful things here in Salt Lake City. I've seen Mormon moms rise up and say, we're going to get this anti-fascist banner up there because the Nazis are trying to, say some bullshit. I've seen, youth that had never gone to a protest before suddenly, look up a lot of information on the internet. And there's so much information out there, right, about how to be ready, how to take care of your body, how to take care of your safety. But I think something we often don't talk about is the interpersonal, and those are, in my opinion, so important. Like I see so often that we talk about security culture, as the comrade just named, security culture, all of the nitty gritty tech stuff, but then we forget about the interpersonal, de-escalation tactics. That's security culture. Knowing how to talk to your homies. That's security culture. Not butting into shit that that doesn't make sense for you to butt into. I think one of the reasons why, at least in my opinion, we're doing rather good on building solidarity here, is because we check in a lot with each other across groups and across different ideologies and across different parts of town. The barrio kids check in with the graffiti kids, who check in with the art kids, who check in with the hipster kids, and we try to build a sense, I think, of solidarity that goes beyond this is my ideology and this is what I believe. I think what we're really trying to build here is we're trying to build something beautiful, something radical, and our own version of things, because every city is different. So we try our best.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing folks involved in anti-repression work from Grand Rapids, Salt Lake City, Madison, Atlanta, and Seattle. So who are some folks right now who your crews are supporting or who are in your area that are facing especially heavy repression, either people that have an ongoing case currently, and there's either write-in campaigns, phone zaps, or fundraising specifically for them, or just amplifying the information, or folks that have actually already started serving sentences that could use some letters or some money on their commissary or just their name being on people's lips?
Our more serious repression has really just now been ramping up. A lot of people who caught charges from the late May riots only caught charges very recently, a good majority of them. And since things have been so intense consistently, a lot of the serious charges have come within the last month and a half. So all of our people are pretty much pretrial. And so we're going off of the wishes of their defense attorneys and their support crews individually, and trying to help them amplify their own messages. So consistently looking back to our Twitter account will, once things become public for individuals, would be really helpful in the Pacific Northwest area, and the so-called Pacific Northwest area for us. We're also, being supported by the Northwest Community Bail Fund, and so would really appreciate donations being made to the Northwest Community Bail Fund, because they've been instrumental in helping us get people released from the uprising, and then in general supporting communities here in the Seattle area. But as cases start to go to trial, I'm sure we'll have much more public information, but some of these trials haven't been set until March of next year at the earliest.
So this is Liam from Madison. There's been specifically one person named Joshua Musa, aka Devoneer Johnson, who was targeted for being a protest leader and allegedly extorted people at a restaurant and told them they have to buy him some food. Otherwise, he'll wreck the place, allegedly. And because of the fact that there was like some salad that's crossed state lines, the feds are looking to get him with a federal felony of extortion, which is a bunch of bull. Looks like he has a plea agreement in that might reduce his sentence, and he finally got out. And we've had multiple like support protests for him. But yeah, Joshua Musa. I mentioned Marquand Clark, who goes by Sire, who was targeted for being a black protest leader and then being pinned with the city county building alleged firebombing, and had his parole revoked for, looks like, might be spending 5 years in because he's being targeted for the protest movement. Yeah, hoping to show some support for him. He's currently in jail at the Dane County Jail, and could use some commissary contributions, and then going to need a lot of public support possibly for his revocation. Of course, I'll let you know. And then Greg James is looking at some years for like allegedly harassing officers. And then Kelsey Nelson also looking at some years for allegedly burglarizing a place. And so, yeah, those are the names I would say that folks that could use support in some way or another. And it's really only Marquand Clark who's inside jail still, unfortunately. So he could really immediately use some commissary support at the Dane County Jail. Oh, and if you want to contribute to Free the 350 Bail Fund, we'll continue to support folks who are arrested for protest, as well as folks who are we focus on black folks who are in jail who can't afford bail too. So yeah, plug that.
I just want to go ahead and name, Bernardo Palacios Carvajal, presente, ahora y por siempre. You didn't deserve to die so young. Every time I walk the streets and I see your name graffitied on the side of a building, I always, just look up at the sky and think of you, homie. Siempre con nosotros en tu memoria, pues por eso. As far as like where to donate, the Salt Lake Community Bail Fund is live. We are very, very proud of having that live. If you just look it up, Salt Lake Community Bail Fund. We're not a nonprofit. All of the money just goes towards continuing to bail out all of the homies experiencing repression here.
Well, I guess, yeah, first off, I'd like to thank all y'all for participating in this conversation, taking the time to prepare this on such short notice, and for all of the work that you're doing. It's really fucking awesome that so many people from all over the country are stepping up to offer support in all these ways and learn all these new skills to be in solidarity with each other as we struggle for liberation. I was hoping now to open it up for folks to sort of address each other with questions if they had any. So go ahead and take the floor as you feel.
Yeah, it's been really inspiring here watching groups of people come together to support each other and then like make the same mistakes that probably like our generations or my generation of people made as well. And really just sometimes I feel desperate in my attempt to be like, no. I've seen people try this. That doesn't work. Try this other thing. And people are doing such an incredible job of caring for each other, especially in these moments in the streets. But I think getting ahead of themselves in terms of like an attempt to outsmart or outwit or out something a state apparatus that is just absolutely a monolith, and like such a power. And from our perspective, I think a lot of the thing that's gonna we do anti-repression work because we think no one should be in prison, but also because we want the rebellion to continue and to maintain, because the rebellion is the thing that means at the end no one will be imprisoned. And really trying to push that like that thing that has happened over the last couple of decades of like finding each other and building that capacity, and sometimes doing that really fast, right? Because everything's been really fast lately. But just a heavy emphasis on like what are the ties that bring us together? It's really important.
I guess I didn't think to ask about like what what folks think about the concept of burnout in this sort of, in this sort of work in general, but this is such an incredibly tense time and deadly for so many people. And yeah, so many people in detention, so many people getting ripped away from families across borders, within borders, like COVID, evictions, just all the like that. Trying to do anti-repression work among them, like the middle of it, I could see as being something that's in some ways kind of empowering. Like I am literally doing something that I can try to measure, like fighting back on this, but also it could contribute to just everything feeling so overwhelming at the same time.
Yeah, I think burnout is a huge danger. We like our shit because we're so busy handling whatever the current crisis is. We aren't focused on training up new people that could take some of the work off our hands. And, burnout comes in a few different forms. Like there's just being tired from doing too much. That's not the biggest threat of burnout. I think like one of the biggest causes of burnout is just dismay from this is very hard. And sometimes there's conflict and it doesn't feel good. And it, in the worst cases, like people get really depressed. And like we've seen it with COVID with our mutual aid efforts that like at the beginning when a thing is a crisis, you get tons and tons of volunteers and everybody's something. But just as stuff goes on and it continues to be hard day in, day out, or as people, the novelty wears off, like it's effusing so much of the weight, and you're seeing the more like peripheral volunteers kind of fall to the sides. I think the threat of burnout is really huge, and the effort is to be focused. How do we get new people involved? How do we set up systems that make it easy for new people to get involved? Like we need to have for each aspect of things that new people can get involved, a 101 document on each part of the process so that when new people get involved, they feel like they have a way to plug in. Because I think another way that we get people dropping out is they plug in, but then there's not an obvious way for them to participate. And, nothing is in person now, so that's even harder. And the people who are doing stuff are so busy doing that stuff that they forget to get new people involved. So we've definitely seen it. At the very beginning when it was 50 arrests a night, none of us was sleeping, ill-advised. We were operating on like a couple hours of sleep a night, and we weren't doing a good job, and we committed critical errors. We forgot people, like we left people in because we just were not like cognitively after that kind of like mistreatment of our bodies. And I think some of us that have been putting in the longest hours are still not treating ourselves the way that we should be. And it's got bad outcome for the help because they're depending on us to like be there for them. So taking it easy on yourself and like not taking on so much responsibility that you're unable to take breaks is actually like, that's a responsibility, so if you're dropping the ball on that, then you're dropping the ball on what you're trying to do. And we should hold each other accountable to like be doing the self-care. Self-care is so hard, but like we should figure out the ways that it is like a serious part of our work.
When I think about burnout and like long-term, just doing the work long-term, I think of this thing that Cindy says, right? Try anarchism for life. Because when I first got into anti-repression work, I was just, like a young anarchist who was thinking about, my own immigration status, my own involvement in things. And then I got a phone call one day and said, everybody has been arrested. And I said, what do you mean everybody has been arrested? And they said, yes, everybody, every single person in the crew. and I just, in that moment, I didn't know what to do. And so they said, can you make a flyer And I said, sure. Can you make a press release? I don't know how to make one of those, but I guess I'll Google it, And within 24 hours, my life had changed, and it had, become what it has become now, I guess. And I think of, and I guess I tell that story because I think of what Cindy says, right? Try anarchism for life. And for me, it's when I go to sleep, I go to sleep like an anarchist. And when I make toast, I make toast like an anarchist. And I think for me, what that means is I try to take care of myself in very soft, tender, intentional ways, because I think we live in a world that usually discards of people like us. And I think we live in in a system that is actively trying to hunt us. So I just try to build those boundaries, and sometimes it hurts, because sometimes I feel like, man, I'm not doing enough. Some days I feel like I'm not doing shit, but I just keep thinking, I think there's something radical and intentional about living every single day and you don't have to be an anarchist, right? Maybe you're an anti-fascist, maybe you're just a comrade, someone who cares, but yeah, every single day that you live in an intentional way to try to fight against the repression that we are all currently experiencing, some of us, more in the face than others, that's another day that you're giving to your comrades and that you're giving to yourself at the end of the day, right? Yeah, so it's, I don't know, I get poetic about anti-repression sometimes, but I just firmly believe that our self-care is so important and so critical, and that to prevent burnout is in itself like an anti-fascist tactic.
And this feels like it's been going on since forever, right? But we're at the beginning of this. People's trials are going to last for years, and some people are going to go to prison for sometimes. So I think there might come a day's time as the easy before times. So we need to build it to where we can make it sustainable.
It just reminds me of the just fact that the civil rights movement lasted from the late 40s into the early 70s. This is this broad arc of movement building that takes place over decades. And even though it's the first rebellions and uprisings that have happened in a lot of folks' lifetime, and you want the revolution and the overthrow of capitalism to be right around the corner, it's probably not. It'd be cool if it was. It might be, but we should plan on it not being around the corner necessarily, and plan on, just like history shows, the movement lasting for years, maybe decades, and things like that. And then, I don't know, it just got me to thinking about my own struggles with burnout, and how movement work kind of attracts manic personalities and things like that, because I definitely put myself in that category, going through manic and then depressive kind of cycles or whatever. And I just see it over and over again over the decade of movement work I've been doing. It's just doing so much movement work nonstop, and we're up till 4 a.m. and stuff, doing jail support after we're out protesting all night and breathing in tear gas and things like that. And then then you just completely have to withdraw. I'm speaking up for my own self, my experience as what I see as a manic and depressive kind of personality traits, and then just completely withdrawing. And I guess that's not a problem, right? Because we need to be able to incorporate all types of personalities for the movement, but then it's whenever so it's important to make sure that you're not the only person heading up a number of things, and that you're training new folks, so that if you do need to withdraw, because you've got to done such manic organizing, for which ideally you shouldn't be doing that, right? That's a skill I need to learn, but you just get so excited in things like that when the first rebellions in decades is happening and cop cars are burning, what you've wanted forever. And then but just making sure that there's other folks there that you can pass the baton to, and that that different movement work isn't going by the wayside. And I used to be into Trotskyism, but now I love anarchism, especially because of our focus on, the prison system and kind of devotion to abolition. And yeah, so it's like there's a lot of jail support and prison support that happens, and it's important that we're not like leaving folks who are on the inside, in the blue or with no support. So yeah, very important to be training new folks. And yeah, it's interesting trying to tackle with the, when these movements and uprisings are happening, there's tons of folks that want to volunteer. Like we had so many folks, and we're like, well, being in the bail fund is like a very complicated thing. Like there's a lot of technical and bureaucratic the obstacles that you have to maneuver and be knowledgeable about. So when we want to get folks involved, but it's like you can't really. And so yeah, like I guess like focusing on building those training systems up and like would be important skill to have. And having said that, it's like we need to learn that too here. I'm not like good at these things yet, obviously, as I'm saying. But yeah, those are just some of my thoughts on burnout.
Yeah, the training thing, we super suck at that. Our group really only came together as like a formal organization as opposed to being a group of friends doing things. Earlier this year, not necessarily in May, we never needed a volunteer before. It was always just like we got it, because it was never so much that required, that much work. A handful of cases at a time, you'd follow them, help people through their cases or whatever. And now we're really scrambling and struggling with what kinds of, having to figure out like which parts of the work do we give to other people and how do we build trust? Because yeah, the thing that is I keep getting reminded by is that the revolution came, but I like still had to like go to school, and that was a really difficult time frame, I think, for everybody, was especially as like, summer transitioned into fall and unemployment benefits started to drop off, and that little like niche of like comfort that we like found in the demos and like the ways in which we all of a sudden had to like go back to work, or we're always at work, as we're preparing for the election, like I'm kind of like, wow, I have midterms at the same time, and personal obligations and difficulties. And so like, yeah, figuring out how to train new people has been a really interesting dynamic for us, also in trying to like learn how to trust people and trust their intentions and trust their work, and not necessarily old guard it too hard, because that can be really detrimental of like not allowing new people and like gatekeeping. There's a lot of our work that we keep really in-house. Like we hold defendants' anonymity as much as they can, and their privacy really, 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 really strong. Everything from like, from arrest to your court, we try and hold people's privacy really at the forefront, because being arrested is such a vulnerable position. Your face ends up on the, you're basically beaten up on camera, and then it's shown on the news, and then people watch you at your most vulnerable moment. And so we're really trying to like give people some agency back in that scenario. But it's been a difficult process. I consistently think about, the kind of like you were talking about in terms of the arc of like the history or whatever, and like, how we're entering into this kind of like, over 14,000 people were arrested in the uprising, and there's over, 300 people with federal charges related to the uprising. And we're entering into that kind of like early 1970s era of like when, all of the Panthers were in prison, not all of them, but like when a huge portion of the Panthers were in prison and the BLA was getting rounded up, and, there's a whole new generation of political prisoners being formed right now. At the same time as we have, far right violence, like we're entering into our own years of lead in a certain sense, in a lot of places, but like a lot in the Northwest. And the trauma of state and far right violence is certainly leads to burnout. Sometimes in my head, I'm just kind of like, well, we're nowhere near as tired as Portland. So I kind of hold that to a certain model where watching comrades and friends and people in Portland just stand up for things and against fascism, especially over the last 5 years, if not the last 30 years, has been like a deep inspiration about like how to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Well, I'm going to jump in now and end this panel. Y'all are, again, just to to gush again. Y'all are amazing, and thanks so much for this conversation. And I know people are going to get a lot out of it. I already have.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet y'all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been super interesting listening to everybody.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.